Time for the newspaper review. This is where Alice and I take a look at the stories making headlines around the world. We shall begin with events in Ukraine, obviously still making many front pages. The Moscow Times takes a look at President Putin's continued denial that heavily armed troops in Crimea are Russian.
And the 5th anniversary of the start of the Bank of England's quantitative easing measures makes the front page of the Financial Times. The paper's chosen this time to evaluate its successes.
The Independent reports that the impact of immigrants on British workers is negligible. That's according to an unpublished government review into the matter.
And back to the Financial Times now. And Facebook has bowed to anti-gun campaigners by introducing new rules to regulate the sale of firearms on the site.
In the Times, the head of Britain's Veterinary Association calls for an end to the ritual killing of animals. There is concern that the traditional practice of slaughter for halal and kosher meat causes unnecessary suffering.
And finally, a study in the Daily Telegraph characterises British women as the queens of leisure, with more spare time than women in other European countries.
Rolake Akinkugbe, head of energy research at EcoBank, is with us. Lovely to have you with us, Rolake.
Thank you.
I would never accuse you of being a woman of leisure.
Not at all.
Let's talk about the Moscow Times. It's quite tricky actually to find a headline that's different to pressure on, to make a diplomatic solution. Sanctions now coming through. That's come through overnight. But Putin here dismissing claims that the troops in Crimea are Russian. He's saying that you need to kind of look a little bit closely and don't accuse us readily.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. It's almost like a tale of two conflicts, essentially, because on the one hand, you have the high-level diplomatic talks, and then you have this dynamic going on where these troops are turning up with masks. Residents of the Crimea are saying they're coming with Russian plate numbers, and they have these sophisticated weapons, which you would then ask if they were random self-defense forces. How would they have access to such weaponry? But the fact is, there is certainly a belief locally that they may have some support from Russia, but that's not being proved. The question is, how are they able to block the Ukrainian military authorities and prevent Ukrainian troops from conducting their own military exercises? So it's a bit of a tense situation, and one which could escalate potentially if not tackled.
How have you been viewing the crisis in Ukraine? How has it affected your work and your outlook?
Well, it's interesting because if you put it in the grander scheme of things, sort of the post-Cold War order hasn't really worked. And there is a broader strategic issue about how former Soviet Union countries like Ukraine will align themselves with Russia going forward, or with the West. And does it have to be a trade-off per se? Can we reach some sort of mutually convenient agreement, a consensus on this crisis?
It's a big question, isn't
very,
it?
very big question.
Yet.
It's not been answered yet.
No.
Yeah.
OK, let's move on to the Financial Times. It features twice this morning. But to begin with, looking at the front page, the 5th birthday of quantitative easing here in the UK, this pumping of money, this buying up of government bonds. When you read this article and when you think it's now rolled into its 5th year, do you think it's been a successful policy?
Well, I think it really depends on what side of the fence you sit. I was telling Naga earlier on that as someone who used to be a big saver, I've seen interest rates come down, which to some extent, when you move to the borrowing side, potentially buying a home, looking at mortgage rates, that's a good thing. But overall, what it set out to achieve was a degree of economic stability, which the Bank of England would argue we've achieved that. But then when you take your cues from what the Fed is doing, the Fed will be tapering. Will the British also do the same thing? The other point to make is that quantitative easing was meant to be a temporary solution to a broader crisis. Now it's got into its 5th year. When is it going to end? And when is the Bank of England going to send out real signals about potentially tapering, as their counterparts in the US have done? So it's had a real mixed impact on the UK economy. Output is still relatively moderate. GDP growth is moderate. Interest rates 0.5%. What would it take to see a change in course? I don't think we've reached that point yet.
And that's what's so interesting, isn't it? Just to remind ourselves that this was meant to be a short, sharp, temporary injection into the economy.
Absolutely.
At its nadir in 2009, and yet here we are.
Yeah.
5 years on.
And it's actually really
talking
difficult
about
to measure the real impact of QE. very difficult to measure.
Yeah.
You know, something else that's really difficult to measure but doesn't stop being controversial and a very, very emotive subject is immigration. Now, it's not only an issue in the UK, it's an issue all over Europe, and it's an issue that politicians have been grappling with and defending and seeing votes change, particularly here in the UK. In the UK, we've seen certain parties who have jumped on the immigration bandwagon doing quite well.
Yeah.
Now this report has come out saying that the impact of immigrants on British workers is actually negligible.
It's an interesting one, and there are some reports which say the report was actually out last year but hadn't been published.
Which is interesting.
Which is interesting, and the suggestion is that Theresa May, counter to what she was saying, may actually be isolated. She seems to have a different position to what other ministries are saying.
She's our Home Secretary.
She's the Home Secretary. And actually, labour market statistics, I found they said 87% of new jobs went to British workers over the last year. So perhaps the question is, are we being told the full picture in terms of the impact of immigration on British workers? And also, you know, the rhetoric tends to get a lot stronger as we reach election periods. So I think it's going to be interesting to see whether we're being given all the information on this particular issue. But it's a very emotive subject.
I think what's clear as well is it comes out, one of the quotes in The Independent, Home officials claim that other departments are, and I quote, institutionally biased towards immigration. It's beginning to show the true colours of the parties, isn't it?
Yeah, exactly. And also looking at the conflict in policy priorities between departments and how they view this issue. Also very interesting, because what they said before was for every additional 100 immigrants, 23 British workers would not be employed. But other statistics are now probably testing that claim quite seriously.
But also a question, I suppose, is how far will this, to what degree will this report actually reach the great British public? It's on the front page of The Independent. I've not had a thorough look through the Daily Mail, but I'd like to know where it features in there.
Yeah, and why is it not being published?
And the reason you mentioned the Daily Mail is that obviously immigration is something that the Daily Mail is a subject that it has taken up as a cause, so to speak, in recent months, in recent years perhaps. We go back to the Financial Times. Facebook. Just explain, Rolake, what's going on here. It's bowed to anti-gun violence campaigners.
Yeah, and this is also now the second constituency of campaigners over the last year that Facebook has essentially caved into. This is over gun sales, which anti-gun campaigners are saying that young people are having access to or being able to buy guns through their interactions on Facebook. Now, the interesting thing to point out is that they can actually complete sales of guns on Facebook, but certainly it does provide the avenue, the allegation provides the avenue for these types of interactions to take place that lead to the guns.
Marketplace.
Exactly. But the broader question is, to what extent can Facebook be interventionist? Obviously, there was a campaign last year about violent images on Facebook, which Facebook also caved into. But it does fit into the broader debate in the US and elsewhere about gun control. So it's also a reflection of what's happening in terms of contemporary trends around gun issues, and also issues around alcohol, for instance, or gaming, which is something else that Facebook is also looking at.
And it's like all of these sites, Facebook, Instagram, WhatsApp, for example, they've just mushroomed so quickly and exploded. How can regulation possibly keep up?
Yeah, how can it possibly keep up?
This is a very sensitive story on the front page of The Times. It's sensitive in many ways. It's sensitive if you're an animal lover. It's sensitive if you have certain religious beliefs and you feel you're being attacked. Just explain what it's about.
Well, this is a call that was made by John Blackwell, who's the president-elect of the British Veterinary Association, and he says the traditional practice of slitting animals' throats, as you would do with halal meats, needs to be regulated because these animals bleed to death. And also with halal meat, the animals are not stunned before they're killed, which I guess would numb the pain. But it's a very tricky issue to regulate. The halal meat market in the UK is worth
kosher,
about, and kosher meat for the Jews is worth about $2 billion in Britain. But other countries in Europe, for instance, have actually moved to change the laws around this. But to what extent can you legislate around these issues that straddle the boundary between animal rights and religious practices? It's a very, very difficult one.
It's very
Without
tricky.
being accused of discriminating against religious minorities.
Yeah.
Absolutely. But then animal welfare, a very emotive subject here in the UK as a nation,
and there's
we like to
a huge
say.
constituency and interest groups who are advocating for animal welfare.
OK, British women crowned queens of leisure. I very cheekily implied that Alice is one, and she absolutely is not. We're all very hard-working. What's this about?
I was going to say, what Britain are they talking about? Funny, because in the previous paper, there was a headline that said, why British women really can do it all. So on the one hand, British women are multitaskers. On the other hand, they're queens of leisure. And according to this report, it says British women spend 126 minutes a day watching television and 87 minutes seeing Friends. They clock up an average of 339 minutes a day relaxing, 61% more leisure than Chinese women. So the question is, how productive are British women in other areas of life, and how do they really realistically find this time?
Or are we just so good at multitasking that you can...
We can
well,
relax.
that must be the argument, and maybe it's a good thing for their mental well-being and social well-being.
Well, you get to work, we'll get to work. We'll see you soon, Rolake. Alice and I will see you at the top of the hour.